I had exactly $47 in my checking account and a quarter tank of gas when I turned off the Trans-Canada onto the crumbling gravel road leading to my grandfather's fishing camp. The birches on either side had already gone bone white, stripping their last October leaves against my windshield in the gray northern dark. 6 hours north of Toronto, a duffel bag on the back seat, a dying laptop on the passenger floor, and a folded property deed I hadn't looked at in 3 years. I was looking for solid ground, any kind of solid ground at all. What I found buried beneath rotting spruce floorboards and 30 years of careful, deliberate silence is something I still have trouble explaining to people who weren't there. My collapse had taken 53 days. I had been a portfolio manager and co-founder at a boutique investment firm on Bay Street, Caldwell Meridian Capital, the kind of shop with glossy brochures and a corner view of the lake and a client list that made other analysts jealous at industry dinners. My business partner, a man named Saul Dennison, had co-built it with me from nothing. I was the numbers guy, the infrastructure, the back-end architecture of the whole operation. Saul was the face. He had a handshake you could put your whole weight on and a way of making every client feel like the smartest person in the room. I had trusted him with things I should have verified. I woke up on a Tuesday in August to find the Ontario Securities Commission had frozen every account connected to the firm. Saul had been running a parallel scheme for 3 years, skimming carry fees into a web of shell companies registered in Belize and the Cayman Islands, using our legitimate fund as a front. The OSC investigation cleared me of criminal liability after 7 weeks of audits that stripped my reputation regardless. Civil suits from investors followed anyway. By the time the last one settled, I had nothing left but legal bills, a name attached to the wrong headlines, and the specific humiliation of watching the story run on BNN with a photo of me walking out of a Bay Street tower, looking like I'd been hit by something I hadn't seen coming, which, in every way that mattered, was exactly what had happened. My girlfriend of 4 years helped me pack 1 box from the apartment the week my car was repossessed. Then she kept the rest. My landlord gave me 30 days. I moved into a friend's spare room for 2 weeks, and then that arrangement quietly expired as well. I was going through a storage bin of old documents one night when I found it. A yellowed envelope sealed with a strip of masking tape that had dried and curled at the edges. Inside was a property deed, my grandfather's fishing camp on Trout Creek Lake in the Haliburton Highlands, except the deed had transferred to my name 3 years earlier upon his death. I had missed the lawyer's call. I had missed the reading of the will. I had been too busy building what I thought was something permanent to notice I had already inherited something real. My grandfather had been a quiet, precise man, a retired master watchmaker and jeweler who'd spent 30 years working out of a small atelier in Montreal before selling everything in the late 90s and retreating to the Haliburton Highlands. He told my father it was for the fishing. My father told me not to bother him, that he had earned his solitude. I had visited once, when I was 12, and I remembered dark pine walls, the smell of machine oil, and a man who said very little but looked at everything like he was memorizing it. The property was technically mine. I had nowhere else to go. I drove north. I arrived just as a hard early frost was settling over the lake. The camp sat on 3 acres of Canadian shield at the end of a 2-track road through second-growth boreal forest. I almost didn't recognize it as a building. The main cabin leaned slightly west, the green metal roof buckled under a fallen birch no one had cleared in years. The dock had collapsed, half its planks floating loose against the rocky shore. The windows were black with grime. The propane lines disconnected. The wood stove pipe had separated from the chimney, and the porch railing had rotted off entirely at the posts. I stood there in the cold, watching the last flat light of October die over the granite ridge line across the lake, and the feeling that came over me was not grief. It was something uglier, a quiet, clarifying fury at the entire shape of the past year, at Saul, at the investors who had sued me personally despite knowing I hadn't architected any of it, at myself for not looking harder when I should have. I had made Saul Dennison rich. I had handed him the keys to everything. And now I was standing in front of a collapsing fishing camp in the Ontario wilderness with $47 and nowhere on earth to sleep that was actually mine. I pulled the crowbar out of the back seat and walked up the broken porch steps. The first 3 days were a lesson in things I should have learned a long time ago. I slept on a foam pad in a sleeping bag rated to -10 in the least damaged corner of the main room, next to a wood stove I had to repipe myself using clamps and fire starter from a Canadian Tire in Minden. I ate gas station food and instant oatmeal heated on a camp stove. My hands, soft from years of keyboards and quarterly reports, split and bled by day 2. By day 3, they had just gone numb and I kept working. I tore out the worst sections of warped, blackened wall cladding. I chainsawed the fallen birch off the roof, badly, nearly taking out the ridge beam, but I managed. I cleared enough of the interior to understand the structure, and as I did, I started noticing things that didn't add up. The exterior was rough-hewn plank and corrugated tin, the aesthetic of a modest retired fisherman. But behind the paneling, where I expected old-growth timber or standard framing, I found steel. Not just angle brackets for reinforcement, full welded channel sections, industrial grade, floor to ceiling in 16-inch centers. The subfloor felt like concrete under the boards. Someone had built a bunker and dressed it in flannel. I filed that away and kept working. The storm arrived on my 6th night. A heavy early-season system that swept down from James Bay and hit the Highlands with the full weight of an Ontario autumn. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 hours. Rain came in sideways, then turned to sleet around midnight. Water began finding every gap in the patched roof, trickling down in thin, dark rivulets along the steel walls. I was kneeling near the granite fireplace, working on a fire with damp birch from under the woodpile, when I heard the floor move. Not creak, move. A low structural groan from beneath me, followed by the sharp crack of something giving way under load. I scrambled back as a 2-foot section of the main floorboards dropped inward, pulled down by a surge of rainwater that had undermined the soil beneath the cabin's west corner. I grabbed my headlamp and crawled to the edge of the hole. I expected to see water, rock, and foundation pillars. What I saw instead was smooth, perfectly flat concrete, a slab poured level to within a millimeter, invisible from above, with a single seam running through its center, and flush with that seam, a heavy steel hatch with a recessed lifting bar and a Medeco padlock. I recognized the model immediately. I had spec'd that same lock for our server room on Bay Street. It cost $900. You don't put a $900 padlock on a seasonal fishing camp. My hands were shaking when I picked up the crowbar. I tore the remaining floorboards back, exposing a concrete slab the size of 2 parking spaces. I went out to the car in the sleet, popped the trunk, and pulled out the angle grinder I'd bought 2 days earlier. I ran an extension cord in through the window, fitted a cutting wheel, pulled down my safety glasses, and knelt by the lock. The Medeco fought me for nearly 25 minutes. The first cutting wheel cracked and had to be replaced. Sparks burned small black holes in my jacket. But the lock finally sheared with a sharp, clean snap, and the sound of it hitting the concrete slab rang through the empty cabin like a gunshot. I gripped the recessed handle. The hatch was counterweighted, heavier than I expected, but it rose on its hinges with a mechanical smoothness that told me it had been engineered carefully and maintained. The air from below was dry, cool, and smelled of machine oil and cedar. I shone the headlamp down a set of steel grate stairs and descended. The room below was roughly 8 meters by 12, encased entirely in poured concrete with a waterproof membrane on every surface. Climate-controlled. A bank of deep-cycle marine batteries wired to a solar array, which I later found mounted invisibly on the north face of the ridge, was still running the humidity system. The fluorescent lights came on immediately when I found the panel, and what they illuminated made me stop breathing. 4 bank-grade filing cabinets bolted to the far wall, each with combination locks. But it was the shelving units in the center that stopped me. Rows of Pelican cases, military spec, stacked and labeled in my grandfather's small, precise handwriting. I opened the nearest one. Inside, in custom-cut foam, were coins. Not loose coins, graded, slabbed numismatic specimens in individual holders, each catalogued on a card in my grandfather's script. PCGS MS65, 1921 50-cent piece. I knew enough about Canadian numismatics to understand that a single 1921 half-dollar in that condition could fetch $60,000 at auction. There were 46 specimens in that case alone. The next case held gold, Royal Canadian Mint 1-ounce maple leafs in sealed original packaging. Beside them, in acid-free cloth, pre-1933 British sovereigns struck at the Ottawa Branch Mint, a coin whose production had stopped nearly a century ago. I picked one up and turned it over. The detail was flawless. My grandfather had not been a modest retired tradesman on a fisherman's pension. He had, quietly, methodically liquidated his entire career into hard, portable, anonymous assets and buried them under a shield of rotting wood and Canadian wilderness, decades before I understood what any of it meant. There was a ledger on top of the nearest cabinet, black, cloth-bound. I opened it. The entries were meticulous, dates going back 30 years, purchases, appraisals, provenance records for every piece. But near the back, the entries changed. They were about loans, private loans documented to the cent. And on the fourth-to-last page, a name I recognized with the specific physical sensation of cold water hitting the back of my throat. Saul Dennison. A loan of $160,000, dated 12 years ago, to fund a business venture described simply as Meridian Capital, seed early formation. My grandfather had funded Saul's initial stake in our firm. The firm Saul had used to steal from our clients, the firm that had destroyed me. The entry below it, dated 6 weeks before my grandfather died, read, "He knows what is below this house. He has sent someone to ask about the land. Do not let him have it. If I am gone before this is settled, find my grandson first." I stood in that concrete room without moving for a long time. Then I heard gravel. I killed the lights and went up the stairs, easing the hatch closed behind me. I crossed the dark cabin and put my eye to the gap in the window tarp. Through the sleet, headlights were crawling down the 2-track road. A truck, new from the LED running lights, it pulled into the clearing and stopped. A man in a waxed canvas jacket climbed out, unhurried, and walked to the porch. He knocked. I opened the door. He was mid-50s, well-kept, with the particular deliberate calm that costs money to sustain. His eyes moved through the cabin interior with a quiet efficiency that was doing accounting the entire time. "I saw the lights on," he said. "My name is Hartwell, Nigel Hartwell. I own the development company that has been assembling properties along this stretch of lake." He produced an envelope from his inside pocket. "I knew your grandfather slightly. Understood man. When I heard the estate had finally resolved, I wanted to reach out directly. I imagine you're looking at this place and seeing a significant problem." He held out the envelope. 80,000. Cash. As is, no inspections, no conditions. You walk away solvent. 80,000 Canadian dollars. My credit cards were maxed. I was sleeping in a cabin without running water in October. That number meant something very concrete. But I thought about my grandfather's eyes, the Medico lock, the steel walls, the 30 years of patience buried beneath this floor. A man who hides something with that level of care does not choose a worthless piece of land to hide it under. "No," I said. Hartwell's expression didn't change. He put the envelope away and mentioned, almost gently, a provincial heritage easement process that could reclassify the access road and render the property inaccessible. A problem I might want to avoid by acting now. "Then I'll deal with the road," I said. "I'd like you to leave." He nodded once, the nod of a man filing something away, and walked back to his truck. I stood in the dark after his taillights disappeared and understood 3 things at once. Hartwell wasn't buying the land. He was buying the secret beneath it. He was connected to Saul. He had to be. And he would come back, and probably not with an envelope. I drove to Minden the next morning and spent money I didn't have on a generator, a security camera, a deadbolt kit, and materials to reinforce the hatch from below. I pawned my Seiko Presage, the watch my father had given me when I graduated, for $340 and used 200 of it on a satellite-capable router and a signal booster antenna. I had noticed the military-grade satellite terminal wired into the concrete wall of the vault, and I had a theory about what it connected to. I worked for 5 days. I reinforced the cabin door with a steel bar bracket. I wired the security camera to my phone. I descended into the vault and found what I had expected. A hardwired Ethernet port in the concrete wall connected to a router my grandfather had last updated in 2019. A weak signal, but a live one. My grandfather had stayed connected, quietly, through all of it. On the evening of the 5th day, my phone alert went off at 11:47 p.m. 2 vehicles this time. Hartwell's truck and a panel van. 4 men in the dark. 3 of them were carrying equipment, bolt cutters, a hydraulic ram, and something that caught the moonlight in a way I didn't want to think about too carefully. I went down into the vault, closed the hatch above me, and sat down at the satellite terminal with my laptop. My grandfather's ledger was open beside me. The back pages listed routing prefixes and account structures that I recognized immediately. Not because I was a forensic accountant, but because I had built that exact architecture myself. Saul had used the proprietary framework I'd designed for Caldwell Meridian's fund management system to structure his offshore accounts. He had used my own code to hide money stolen partly from our clients, and partly, I now understood, from my grandfather. Above me, bolt cutters hit the reinforced door. I didn't rush. I worked methodically, the way you work when there is exactly one option and it has to be correct. I traced the routing prefix from the ledger to the primary Belize Shell holding company. I confirmed the authentication structure. Yes, Saul had kept using our original framework without ever understanding the back end deeply enough to close the test doors I'd built into it. I wrote a transfer script in 20 minutes. Targeted, clean, irreversible. I did not route the money anywhere I controlled. I wanted Saul finished, not enriched. I transferred the entire liquid balance, $4.3 million in offshore holdings, every account my grandfather's ledger had tracked, directly to a flagged escrow registered with the RCMP's Financial Crime Unit, along with a compiled data packet. The ledger entries, Saul's account routing data, the original Meridian Seed loan documentation, and 3 years of transaction signatures that matched patterns the OSC had identified during their investigation but never traced to source. I hit execute. The progress bar began moving across the screen. The hydraulic ram hit the cabin door above me. I heard it buckle. 62%. The door gave, boots on floorboards, voices, then a pause as they found the open hatch. 81%. Hartwell's voice directly overhead. He's in the vault. Get the torch. A thermal cutting torch. I looked up at the steel hatch plate, 1.5 centimeters of cold rolled steel. 15 minutes minimum in the dark, probably more. 94%. The high whine of the torch firing up above me, the smell of ozone seeping through the seams. 100%. Transfer complete. RCMP Financial Crime Unit, referral ID generated and confirmed. I closed the laptop and exhaled slowly. My hands were still. The torch worked on the hatch for 11 minutes. The hinges glowed orange, then failed one after the other. The steel plate dropped into the stairwell with a crash that rang through the entire concrete room. Hartwell came down the stairs. He stopped at the bottom when he saw me sitting in my grandfather's chair. Hands open on the desk, laptop closed. The fluorescent lights made the whole room look very simple and very clear. His eyes went to the shelving, the pelican cases, the bullion, the filing cabinets, with the expression of a man confirming something he had been told existed but hadn't yet seen for himself. While you were cutting through that hatch, I said, I was on the satellite uplink. I just transferred $4.3 million of Saul Dennison's offshore holdings directly to an RCMP escrow account, along with 30 years of records that document everything. Saul's routing data, the original Meridian Seed loan, and your name appearing twice in my grandfather's ledger. The room was very quiet. Saul Dennison is broke right now, I continued. Whatever he promised you for this job, he can't pay it. Whatever arrangement you've had with him for 3 years while he tried to get access to this property, none of it holds anymore. He is going to be arrested tonight, and you are going to have to decide in the next 30 seconds whether you want to be standing in this vault when the RCMP arrives. From somewhere far above us, beyond the open hatch, beyond the ruined floorboards and the sleet-hammered roof and the black spruce forest, a sound, rising, clarifying itself against the wind. Sirens. Hartwell heard them at the same moment I did. I watched the calculation move across his face. The truck, the distance to the bridge, the weight of what I had just told him about Saul's accounts. And I saw the exact moment the arithmetic stopped working in his favor. He turned without a word and went up the stairs. I heard him running across the cabin above me. Then the engine of his truck, reversing hard into the dark. Then voices, the flat, specific commands of police who have already made their decision. And then nothing but the sleet. The RCMP officers who came down the stairs 20 minutes later found me sitting exactly where I had been. I answered every question they asked, and I kept answering them for the next 11 hours. What followed took months. Saul Dennison was arrested at a hotel in Vancouver 6 hours after the RCMP data packet landed. The financial trail my grandfather had maintained, 30 years of careful, patient documentation, was more complete and more precisely sourced than anything the OSC had been able to assemble independently. The civil judgments against me were reversed within 60 days of the RCMP filing. The OSC cleared my name formally in December. It ran in the Globe and Mail on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Christmas, in a that most people would miss. I read it twice. Hartwell cooperated in full in exchange for a reduced charge and testified against Saul's network. He had been working for Saul for 4 years, applying pressure first to my grandfather, then to the estate, and then to me. The provincial court recognized my full inheritance the following spring. When appraisers from a Toronto auction house arrived at the camp under private arrangement, they spent 3 days in the vault and came out looking slightly stunned. The numismatic collection alone, they told me, was one of the most significant private assemblages assessed outside a national institution. The 1921 specimens. The 1921 the Ottawa Mint sovereigns, a complete set of 1936 dot variety coins in near flawless condition. The bullion was significant but straightforward to value. The historical Dominion of Canada bank notes, unissued, still in original mint bundles, required specialists they had to bring in from Ottawa. I did not sell the coins. I placed the bullion into a trust and used the income to hire a reconstruction firm out of Huntsville. I told them exactly what I wanted. My grandfather's fishing camp rebuilt to its bones, the same green metal roof, the same granite fireplace, the same dark pine interior, the same dock on the same rocky point jutting out into Trout Creek Lake. The hatch remained where it was, polished and restored, the steel gleaming in the living room floor. The most honest thing I own. Last April, on the first warm morning of the season, I was on the rebuilt dock with a coffee, watching the ice break up on the lake, when I remembered a tin box I'd found at the back of one of the filing cabinets months earlier. I'd set it aside during the chaos of the investigation and hadn't returned to it until 2 weeks before that morning. Inside was a watch, a Hamilton 992B railway-grade pocket watch from 1942, the movement in perfect running condition. I'd wound it, set the time, and carried it in my jacket pocket since the day I'd found it. That morning on the dock I took it out and turned it over in the cold spring air, and I noticed what I had missed before, a faint seam on the caseback, barely a hairline. I pressed the edges apart with my thumbnail. The back plate swung open on a tiny hinge. Inside, folded twice and tucked flat against the balance wheel, was a note. One small square of paper in my grandfather's handwriting. Small, even letters, written as though he was conserving space. If you are reading this, you did the hard part first. I know what the world tried to do to you. I have been watching since before you knew you needed watching. The value in that room is not what is on the shelves. It is what you had to become to reach it. Your father never learned to work with his hands. I hoped you would. I am glad I was right. Grandpa, I stood on that dock for a long time after that. The ice was still moving on the lake, sheet by sheet, quiet and slow, the way things come apart in this country, without ceremony, in early morning light that turns the shield the color of old gold. A loon called once from somewhere north of the point and then went silent again. I clipped the watch closed and slipped it into my jacket pocket. It was ticking against my hip all the way back up to the cabin, and it is ticking right now.